What's going on, guys? It's Mason. Today we're going to talk about low fantasy. This is the first of a series of videos I want to do about writing different type of literary devices, literary styles. This is probably considered a literary style, and yeah, I just want to talk about low fantasy, some media and different types of entertainment that use it. And if you want to see anything related to this or any other videos related to writing, literature, or media in the future, let me know. But yeah, what is low fantasy? So it's a subgenre of fantasy, obviously. It gets into things that are kind of magical, but not too crazy. It's usually considered something that's kind of supernatural. There's a show called Supernatural, and many would say that that show is, to a certain degree, low fantasy. It is unrealistic. It tries to keep realistic aspects of it while also incorporating things that are kind of mythical or spiritual, maybe. It intrudes upon a realistic or normal world. So oftentimes you have something like, and this is my next point. It takes place on Earth, right? So it takes place on Earth, but then it has something crazy that happens. Some like the show Supernatural, and there's a lot of other live action shows that also are kind of like that. Sometimes it's in an urban or historical setting. An example of that could be maybe Berserk. Some people might consider that high fantasy. I think for the most part it's considered low fantasy. But a lot of the times the set place of it is on Earth or a planet like Earth. Some aspects of low fantasy. Some aspects of it are, it's often similar to contemporary fantasy where it's got a lot of themes and kind of lessons that it wants to teach. And it's not necessarily like anything too crazy. Like you won't see like a hard magic system. You might see like a soft one. You won't see anything too crazy that can kind of differentiate from Earth. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't, but oftentimes it kind of keeps the fantasy to a minimum. Depending on the media, though, it can change. It varies. The magic is somewhat subtle. Sometimes there's not even magic at all. Some might consider something like Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 and 2 to be low fantasy. Some people think that The Witcher could be considered low fantasy. I personally think it might be a little more towards high fantasy, but that's up for debate. Same thing with Skyrim. The supernatural elements are rational. Usually they're explained in a way that almost kind of makes sense. Like maybe like the Avatar. The Avatar is probably more closer to high fantasy, but the way that um, the bending system works and the magic and the world building, the magic systems in a lot of these shows are kind of intertwined with the Earth or the Earth-like planet. A lot of times it's connected to something like nature or maybe even spirituality. A lot of these things are gritty realism. Another good example, going back to the Berserk example, like a grim dark. Some maybe consider Elden Ring or Dark Souls. Probably Sekiro is the closest one to low fantasy out of all the Souls games. Um, they are heavily inspired by things like fairy tales and folklore. So, like Little Red Riding Hood, things of that nature. Another good example might be Coraline, uh, being low fantasy, kind of taking place in two different worlds, but not too far. That it's like a whole different world and concepts that we have to completely learn that are even new, that are completely new compared to the world we live in now. So some characters in low fantasy and how they act. A lot of the time, the hero is somewhat gritty, kind of cynical, um, and not just the main character, but the villains and the side characters and everybody in the show. Mentors, they're very realistic. Another good example might be Castlevania. We see the main character of that show. He's Trevor. He's very gritty. He's a little cynical, kind of sarcastic. That's what you'll see a lot in this type of media, and it's very interesting to compare characters from this type of shows. Another one is that we might talk about in a second is Game of Thrones. Now, it's heavily debated whether or not this is low fantasy or not. Same thing with things like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Those are also debated. But going back to Game of Thrones, that one is slightly debated. I think it might be a little more closer to high fantasy just because of stuff like dragons and like resurrections and things like that. But a lot of people do consider it low fantasy, and you see that show's very gritty, very dark. You know, it's not a fun time to live in. The characters and especially usually the protagonists are usually human or some type of humanoid. I can't think of any non-humanoid or even non-human characters right now for low fantasy, but oftentimes they are. The human is kind of fighting against a monster, you know, like The Witcher. Now, The Witcher, you know, Witchers aren't necessarily humans, but same thing, kind of like the Dragonborn. They're both humanoid creatures, but oftentimes they're human or humanoid, and you know, they kind of fit the criteria of being gritty, you know, and a lot of times these type of shows are the ones that have like the vampires, the werewolves, zombies, even maybe even like skeletons or just like general monsters. Things like giant bugs. They're oftentimes the creatures that are fought. You know, like Castlevania has the vampires. Skyrim's got things like werewolves. You see that a lot in these type of media. The villains in these are usually political and violent. Sorry, I couldn't get that word out. When they always have like a very, very politically driven motive, and they're not afraid to use violence to reach that conclusion, whether it's hurting the main character or someone the main character knows or cares about. We see this in Castlevania. You know, spoilers ahead, but we see that Dracula wants to wipe out human race. That definitely, I would say that's it almost kind of seems political. And we see this in a lot of different shows, not just low fantasy, but oftentimes low fantasy. When you go to Game of Thrones, you know, though I mean it's called Game of Thrones, it's about the throne and who has control. That show is all about politics, but you know, made up politics. You know, not necessarily politics of people arguing about is this law better than this law, but people just kind of vying for power. You know, they don't really even care about the laws as much as long as it keeps them on top. You do see a lot of violence in these shows. You see a lot of violence because unlike something like a high fantasy show where people can just come back to life or you could just go into the spirit realm or something like that, these shows usually when somebody dies, they're dead for good. And you don't see as much healing magic. You see a lot more like the type of magic that's used might be something like, you know, somebody enhances their weapon or somebody, you know, starts a fire. Might not necessarily be able to shoot flames everywhere, but they can start a small fire and it'll get bigger. Those are the type of things you'll see. Now, you know, that varies, definitely. But you'll see a lot of violence because the theatrics of magic aren't necessarily as intense as they would be in a high fantasy show. Um, a lot of times, it looks like I had a typo right there, but a lot of times there are creatures that are kind of personified. So this kind of, in a way, I guess would contradict my other point, but what I meant by this was you won't see you will see creatures like I said earlier, Red Riding Hood, the wolf, you know. He speaks to Red Riding Hood, and there's also the wolf from the Three Little Pigs and the Three Bears that fairy tale. So you do see a lot of animals that are personified or creatures. And we see in you know, in Skyrim there's creatures that talk. You know, you see in The Witcher a lot of the things that The Witcher hunts talk as well. You do see in like going back to Skyrim, the dragons that talk. You know, you see the dragons talk and they're personified and they have their own agendas and they have autonomy. You see in Castlevania some of the creatures that are in the show, whether they're fighting for the character or fighting against them, talk to the main character, they talk to side characters. So you do see that often, just not usually as the main character. Is I think what I kind of meant is that. So here are some examples. So the Harry Potter series has been debated, but I think it's generally considered low fantasy because it does start on Earth, or at least what we could assume is Earth. And then, you do kind of get into a different type of realm when he goes to school, but for the most part, it's on Earth. A Song on Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones, that is another one that's debated between low and high fantasy. Personally, I do think it's closer to high fantasy because things like, and spoiler warning ahead, but things like, resurrecting from the dead and things like dragons, I think they can really toe the line between high or low fantasy. Another good one is Pirates of the Caribbean. Um, uh, a lot of pirate shows that don't necessarily have, magic in them, but and that show might, I don't remember every aspect of it, but a lot of them don't necessarily have magic. Some of them have will have water magic or magic relating to the ocean, but a lot of pirate shows. And One Piece, I don't know, that show's very long. So there's a lot of things you'd have to keep in mind with that. But there's definitely magic in that with the fruits and other things, but a lot of pirate shows, they have sword fighting more than magic, and they have a lot more one-on-ones more than large-scale battles. Like you'll see in Game of Thrones, there are some very large-scale battles that seem more grounded, more down to earth. And in pirate shows, you'll see there's a lot more 1v1s and, 2-on-1s. And, they still use stuff like swords and also like cannonballs. So more kind of realistic weaponry you'll see in those shows. Another one is Spirited Away. Now, this is kind of what I meant when I talk about kind of the spirit aspect. Obviously, this show has a lot of spiritual aspects, and this show has a lot of metaphors and themes that it tries to, give to the viewer throughout the entire show, and a lot of lessons as well. But yeah, this show is full of things like spirits, but it still takes place on Earth. It takes place almost maybe in the modern day world. The main character's in a car at the beginning, and her parents are with her, and then everything kind of goes from there. So you can see kind of how that's more of a modern version of what I mean. And this is kind of what I meant when I say historical or urban with Pirates of the Caribbean, because not that that actually happened, but it takes place in a different time period. I mean, we see the pirate era with that show. We might see something like close to the modern day with Harry Potter, A Song of Ice and Fire, Skyrim, Witcher. You see more medieval time period. So the time period can really vary. The show Supernatural, you see more modern. So there's no really set timepiece for any of these. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, that goes in the vampires. You see those type of creatures, a lot of well-known creatures usually. Zombies, and then like I said, reanimated corpses or skeletons. I guess you could consider maybe something like Dead Rising low fantasy. I mean, that would probably be considered zombie or horror or apocalyptic. But if you had to classify its fantasy, is it contemporary fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy? It'd probably be low fantasy, or maybe like apocalypse fantasy if that's a category. Supernatural, like I said earlier, and then there's Mount & Blade. That's very interesting because that adds a lot more of just sword fights. Not as many magical elements, but still there's a lot of horses. I mean, it's called Mount & Blade, so you can tell what the game's about. But you do see a lot of more realistic battles in that show. But it still doesn't. I don't think it takes place on Earth, or it takes place on kind of like a altered version. And you do see a lot of things that you would consider realistic and that could actually happen, but there's also aspects that wouldn't happen in that show, or in that game, sorry. So JoJo's Bizarre Adventure it's another example that is somewhat debated. I've seen mixed things online, but I think most people can kind of come to the consensus that, it takes place on Earth. I mean, there's almost like a joke throughout the show that a lot of the places in the show you can actually find in real life. So it is very interesting seeing people, kind of gather with discourse around whether JoJo's is low or high fantasy, but I would consider it low fantasy, but I think it could be somewhat teetering. It really depends on your definition, because too much magic. I mean, the whole show is almost based around the magic system, with stands and everything like that. but the show takes place on Earth, and it takes place in places that actually exist. Another example didn't really think of is Vinland Saga. In fact, Vinland Saga takes place on Earth. It mentions Earth a lot. I actually haven't finished that show, so I don't know everything about it. But from what I do tell, obviously the main character's father, and spoiler warning ahead. The main character's father is a very powerful guy. I mean, we see him do things that no human in real life could do, like fight off you know, a bunch of guys at once. I mean, maybe even like 20, 30. But that show is still grounded in real life. People still die. There's no bringing people back from the dead. There's not even really any magic. It's more of just a show about, you know, religion and philosophy. That takes place on Earth with a little bit of, characters that have eccentric abilities, but nothing beyond what a normal human, like, could perceive themselves doing. Nobody. Some people think they could fight 20, 30 guys, but nobody thinks they can, shoot a ball of fire. So a lot of animes, definitely, and a lot of medieval shows usually have some type of, they're considered low fantasy. Um, I think a lot of the medieval shows, it's a debate. Like I said, Skyrim, The Witcher, um, Game of Thrones, they're all kind of medieval period. Or maybe Renaissance, or however, or Victorian, maybe, however you'd like to classify it. And I think those are all up for debate. I think dragons, once you introduce those, you're definitely teetering. Although they are magical creatures, and what would be the difference between a dragon, a vampire, a zombie? Because Skyrim has skeletons, reanimated corpses, kind of has zombie-like creatures. It's got vampires, werewolves, but then it's got dragons, and it's got different dimensions. It's got gods, and that's another thing. A lot of these shows do have some type of gods sometimes, or deities at least. Some people consider, for example, Greek mythology to be low fantasy. But Greek mythology itself is like a whole. It's a mythology, so it doesn't necessarily fall into, I would say, a content category, I guess. Some people would even say it's maybe even like a mythological fantasy. Um, but yeah, so the key takeaways for low fantasy media and content and the genre itself is it's got supernatural and subtle magic. Nothing too crazy. Nothing that could split the earth in half or whatever world it takes place in. It's got things that are grounded. There's nobody that could kill the whole earth. People fight all the time with smaller, more grounded magical abilities. A lot of the time, the setting and characters are grim and dark. There's actually a whole kind of genre just called grim dark, and no better example than Elden Ring, or Dark Souls, really. I'm not necessarily saying that Dark Souls and Elden Ring are low fantasy. I think the argument is there. They do have a lot more of higher fantasy elements in them as well. But something like Berserk would probably be a good example. That show is very grim, very dark, and the settings and the characters, we just see, what they go through. The world is not a fun world to live in, and that's definitely probably considered low fantasy. It's unsettling. Berserk is an unsettling manga to read. Some of these shows, like Game of Thrones, there's, kind of, gory scenes. You don't get that as much in video games. But yeah, these scenes, they have gory scenes, kind of like haunted houses. One might say Scooby-Doo is low fantasy. Sometimes it's kind of hard when it's more modern, because you get into things like urban fantasy, modern fantasy, maybe even contemporary fantasy. But I could do a different video on all of those. But yeah, haunted, kind of, some people would consider Red Dead low fantasy. You could, argue. And, a type of media can be different things, just because something's, Red Dead could be Western fantasy, or I wouldn't really say historical fantasy, but maybe something along those lines. But that doesn't necessarily mean it can't be low fantasy as well. It really depends. Looks like I had a typo here, but the magic is based on realism. It's not going to get too crazy. It often doesn't get into the divine, even if there are divine aspects, usually the magic comes from something like your spirit, like your soul, or maybe even the world around you. Usually, like something natural that you can see. Like they'll say, "Oh, I can use the oxygen in the air to create fire, or hydrogen to create water, or anything along those lines." Or I can use the carbon in the ground to, make a rock or something. You see that a lot of times the magic is based off of realism and things that could actually happen, relating to things like science. And my final takeaway for this is oftentimes these type of stories, shows, mangas, comics, anime, video games, they're based off of folklore and fairy tales. And we touched on that a little bit. I'm not the expert on fairy tales, but I do know a lot of fairy tales. Like Shrek has like all the fairy tales, but Goldilocks, Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, things like that. You see animals talking as if they were human. You see stories about redemption and stories about evil, and that's all kind of based on the things that we find in these stories as well. So yeah, that was my PowerPoint on low fantasy. I hope you guys like it. It did take me a little while to get this video out. I've just been busy, but I do want to work on some more videos. So let me know in the comments what you want to see. I kind of want to put out a video on Naruto soon. That's one of my favorite animes, and I want to kind of talk about the philosophy, the themes, and maybe even do a little mini analysis on the show. But yeah, so let me know what you want to see. As you can see, I am interested in talking about writing. I'm interested in literature, writing, and you guys know I am interested in everything. I want to make some videos about philosophy, sociology, society, maybe politics, definitely religion. I'm a Christian. I want to make some videos about that. I want to just spread some positivity as well. Maybe make some motivational, inspirational videos. Let me know in the comments what you want to see. Give me some ideas for videos, what I can talk about, what I can touch on. And yeah, if you like the video, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe. And I hope everybody has a good one.